All right, jumping right in. We've got this article, Damned If You Do, and wow, it's something else. It really makes you think. We're going to do a deep dive into Orthodox Christianity and their ideas about salvation, which is, let's be honest, a pretty weighty topic.
A big one, for sure.
So this article, it doesn't pull any punches. I mean,
Yeah.
the author is totally convinced that if you're not Orthodox, well, you're not on the right path of salvation.
Straight to the point.
He even calls out, like, Roman Catholics and Protestants as not having it right.
Yeah, and it sounds like he's not mincing words.
Not at all. He goes so far as to call Rome a joke and even takes issue with some stuff that goes on in other branches of Christianity.
Okay, so then how does that work out for him when he sees other Christians, going through tough times?
That's where things get super interesting.
Mhm.
He talks about the Coptic Christians who are, being persecuted by ISIS, and he admits he finds himself praying for them, even sees them as martyrs.
Right, but according to what he's saying, they're outside of the true church.
Exactly. It's like this huge internal conflict, right?
Mhm.
How can he hold those two ideas in his head at the same time?
And it's something you see come up in other faiths that kind of have that same, like, only one right way thing going on. How do you reconcile that idea with the fact that there are all sorts of devout people out there in different traditions? It's tough.
So, okay, help me out here. How does the Orthodox Church see other Christian denominations? And I guess, how did all these splits even happen?
Right. So they call those splits schisms. Basically, Christianity, instead of being like this big tree with branches going everywhere, this author sees it more as, like a vine
Oh.
with, little shoots that have kind of withered and died off. And those splits, they happened over time because people couldn't agree on different points of doctrine, things they thought were important about what they believed. And that led to, different branches forming like Catholicism, Protestantism, and of course, Eastern Orthodoxy.
I noticed that he uses a really strong word for folks outside the Orthodox Church, heretics. He even talks about martyrs to a heresy, which, I'll be honest, I'm not totally clear on what that means.
So it's like he's wrestling with this idea. If somebody dies for something, for a faith that the Orthodox Church sees as wrong, does that sacrifice still matter? Does it have any weight spiritually?
Wow. Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Heavy stuff.
Definitely. And those Coptic Christians, they're facing some really horrific stuff from ISIS. But despite what he believes, you can tell there's something in him that wants to recognize their devotion.
Like his heart and his head are kind of fighting each other.
Right, exactly. He brings up this idea called branch theory, which is the idea that all these different Christian denominations, they're kind of like, branches of the same tree, all going back to the same trunk, like different ways of expressing the same basic faith. But he's totally against that idea.
So where does that leave him? How does he, I guess, deal with those two opposite ideas?
Well, he talks about universalism, which is the idea that everyone might end up being saved, no matter what they believe. He kind of likes the sound of it, but ultimately it doesn't fit with what he believes as an Orthodox Christian.
So it's almost like he's trying to balance these two things, like acknowledging how powerful God is, how merciful, but also, sticking to what he sees as the strict rules of his faith. Like, I have to believe this is the truth, but God might work in ways I don't fully understand.
Yeah, I think you've got it. That struggle between what we believe and, well, the mysteries of it all. I think that's something a lot of people go through. It's not always about religion, even.
So he's not actually saying that he agrees with this whole universalism thing, is he?
No, he's not endorsing that. He's actually really firm on the idea that Orthodox Christians, they have to believe that people outside the church, they're not on the path to salvation. And that makes their mission, bringing people into the Orthodox faith really important.
Okay, so where do we go from here?
Well, he talks about some practices, some traditions that he sees as having been borrowed from other branches of Christianity, and he's not happy about it, even within the Orthodox Church.
Like, is he talking about specific things?
Yeah, he calls out these Western Rite Orthodox churches, which have adopted some stuff from Roman Catholicism after the whole schism thing happened. And he sees it as a sort of validation of Rome. Like, why would you do that if you believe we're the only ones who have it right?
So if you truly believe your path is the only right one, then even little changes, even if they seem small, they can be a big deal.
Exactly. And that gets us to something that's really hard to wrap your head around. What about someone who sees how good and devoted people are in other faiths, but they also believe that only their church is the true one? How do you square those two things?
It's like a paradox, right? And what about those Coptic Christians? He sees their faith, their suffering, and he even wonders if they were truly dying for monophysitism, which is, well, a whole other theological can of worms.
Right, monophysitism. It's a pretty specific theological concept, and it's a core difference between Coptic Christians and Orthodox Christians.
So even within Christianity itself, there are disagreements about who Jesus was and what his nature represents.
Absolutely. And for this author, those disagreements aren't just academic, they have eternal consequences.
Okay, so back to those Coptic Christians. He's wondering if they were really dying for this monophysitism or for Christ. What's the big deal with that question?
It's really asking, can you be truly devoted to Christ, even if your understanding of him isn't exactly in line with Orthodox teaching? It's like, how far does God's grace extend? It's a question that forces us to admit that maybe we don't have all the answers.
He seems to be stuck between these two truths, right? The absolute truth of his faith and the fact that God's mercy might be bigger than we can imagine.
Yeah. It's like he's saying, I have to believe orthodoxy is the only true path, but I also know that God's ways are higher than ours. That tension, that's something I think a lot of people can relate to, whether it's about religion or something else entirely. We all wrestle with faith, with doubt, and with things we just can't fully understand.
So it seems like he really admires these Coptic Christians,
Yeah.
but he's also stuck with this belief that orthodoxy is the only way.
Yeah, it's like, how do you balance those two things? Admiring their devotion, but also believing they're not on the right path.
And he keeps using that word monophysitism to describe what they believe. I gotta be honest, that's one of those theological terms that makes my head spin a little. Can you break it down for us, normal folks?
Yeah, sure. Monophysitism, it gets into some really deep stuff about Christology. Basically, it's all about how we understand who Jesus was, what his nature was. Super simplified, it's emphasizing the divine side of Jesus, saying he was one nature, fully divine, which is different from what the Orthodox believe. They see Jesus as having both a divine and human nature, two natures in one person.
Gotcha. So even within Christianity, there are these fundamental disagreements about who Jesus was, what it all means.
Exactly. And for the author, these aren't just intellectual debates. He sees them as having eternal consequences, for your soul.
Right, right. Okay, so back to the Coptic Christians and this question of whether they were dying for monophysitism or for Christ. What's the point he's trying to make there?
It's a really interesting question. It's like he's asking, can someone be truly devoted to Christ, even if they don't understand him in the way that Orthodox Christians do? Does their faith still count? It's a question about the limits of what we can understand about God's grace.
So he's wrestling with these two things again. The absolute truth, as he sees it, of his own faith and the possibility that God's mercy is bigger than we can even grasp.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, look, I have to believe that orthodoxy is the only true path, but at the same time, I realize that God's ways are a mystery. I can't pretend to know everything. And I think that struggle, honestly, is something a lot of people can relate to. It's about faith, about doubt, about dealing with the unknown, whether you're talking about religion or anything else that's really important to you.
It's interesting that he sees all these historical splits, these schisms within Christianity, as proof that the issues that caused them must have been really, really important.
Right, if people were willing to break away from the church over these disagreements, then those disagreements couldn't have been about small things. It shows how seriously he takes these theological matters.
Yeah, these splits happen for a reason. What we believe really matters. And that kind of leads him to reject the whole branch theory thing, right? The idea that all these different Christian denominations are just branches of the same tree.
Exactly. He sees orthodoxy as the only real deal, the one true vine, I think he even calls it, that's managed to hold on to the original Christian faith.
But then he says something that I think adds a whole other layer to this. He points out that a lot of people who were part of these other Christian traditions, they didn't actually choose them. They were born into them. It's their family's faith.
Right, and that makes you think about choice versus, what you inherit. If you grew up in a certain faith and you're never really exposed to anything else, can you really say you made a conscious decision to be part of it?
It's like he's saying, okay, people's lives are complicated. They're born into different situations, raised with certain beliefs, and all that shapes how they see the world.
Right, and I think it adds this layer of understanding to his view, which can seem pretty strict. He gets that it's not always simple, people's lives are messy, and their faith is part of that.
It reminds me that for a lot of people, faith isn't just something you think about in your head. It's tied up with who you are, your family, your culture.
Absolutely. And that actually leads into another interesting point he makes, which is that Even though these schisms happened a long time ago, centuries ago, they're still impacting people today.
Like the effects are still rippling out.
Exactly. He says those who are part of these non-Orthodox traditions, they're basically living with the consequences of choices that were made way back when, choices they had nothing to do with.
Wow, that's heavy. Like the weight of history on people's lives. And it makes you think about how powerful these belief systems are, how much they shape the way we understand everything.
And he doesn't shy away from the implications of that either. He's basically saying that even if someone is a good person, a devout Christian in one of these other traditions, they're still, in his view, not in a good place spiritually.
That's hard to hear,
Yeah.
especially when you think about all the genuinely good people there are in all these different Christian communities.
And that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating, right? It makes us think about these really tough questions. It challenges our own assumptions about faith, about what it means to be saved.
It's not about like judging the author or anything. It's about trying to understand where he's coming from, what his beliefs are based on.
And by doing that, maybe we can learn something about the bigger picture, how people try to find meaning, find purpose in a world that can feel pretty chaotic.
I feel like we've been going back and forth on this idea,
Hmm.
recognizing that people are devout, that they really believe in what they're doing, but then this author is still convinced that orthodoxy is the only real way. So how does he kind of bring it all together in the end?
Well, he doesn't exactly give us easy answers, but I think the way he ends it really gets to the heart of what we've been talking about. He goes back to those Coptic Christians, the ones being persecuted, and he asks this question. I do wonder if they were dying consciously for monophysitism or for Christ.
Yeah, it really makes you think
Yeah.
about like how different people can understand and experience faith.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole exploration so worthwhile. It's not about just getting the facts or whatever. It's about asking these really deep questions like, can someone's faith be true even if it's different from what's considered, the right version? What does it even mean to die for something you believe in?
It's not always comfortable facing these questions, but I think it's important to be willing to see things from different angles, even if it makes us question some of our own assumptions.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it reminds us that faith, with all its complexities and contradictions, is a really personal thing. It's a journey that each person has to go on for themselves. And part of that journey is encountering other people's beliefs, even when they're different from ours.
And hopefully we can do that with, some respect and understanding, even when we disagree.
This has been a really interesting deep dive. I mean, we've gone pretty deep into one person's view of salvation, specifically within Orthodox Christianity.
This whole belief system, right? With its own history and all these complicated theological arguments.
But I think we've also touched on something that's bigger than just one person's perspective. We've talked about faith, doubt, the search for meaning, things that I think a lot of people wrestle with.
We've covered schism, heresy, martyrdom, pretty heavy stuff. But it's all part of the story of how people have tried to understand their place in the world, their relationship with God.
And I think we're left with this one last question to ponder. If someone dies for something that's considered a heresy, does their death still have meaning? Does it have any significance spiritually?
That's a question that I think will stick with me for a while. It makes you want to keep learning, keep exploring, and try to understand things a little bit better.